Welcome back. In this video we're going to start building our components for the home page. So we start off by creating the index.js. This file actually has code if you look at it now, so delete that one. We just had that because it should show us something when we installed all, so we know that we were good to go. So every component you do in React, you have to start off by importing React. So we import React from React. This is the JSX syntax for importing modules. We also need to import a package called React DOM for this one. And this package will help us to render out our app in the browser. It has methods for rendering in the DOM. You can use React, for example, for creating native apps or things like that, and then you would use some other package for rendering. We also need to import our app. That's a component that we haven't created yet, but we'll do it soon. And we'll import it from components, app, and app.js. You don't have to write .js because it will know it's a JS document. So just write app. And lastly, we'll import our pre-made CSS file. The last thing we have to do in this file is to call the React DOM render method. And in this method, we specify what we want to render. We want to render our app, and we specify where we want to render it. If you remember, I showed you in the public and the index.html file that we have a div that is called root. So this is where we want to render our app. So we do that by using regular JavaScript syntax for referencing the div in the DOM. We get the element by ID and we get the root. So this is basically everything we need to have in the index.js file. We'll continue creating the base of our app component. So in the app folder, create a new file that is called app.js. And as before, we import React from React. From React. We also need to import the header. This is also a component we haven't done yet. We'll do it in a second, but we'll import it for now, and it will throw an error at us, but we'll fix that later when we create all these components. We import the header from the elements folder, and we have a header and a header file. We also need to import our home component that we'll also create in a second, and we import that from home/home. This is all we're going to need to import for now in this component. We will come back to this component later in the course because we're going to create something called a browser router with links so that we can move from the home page to the individual movies and change page. Well, you should know something. When you create a component in React, you can basically do it in two ways. You can create a stateful class component, and you can create a stateless functional component. We will talk more about this later in the course, but I can shortly just tell you that in a stateful class component, you have access to the state, and you also have access to lifecycle methods that we'll also talk more about later. But for this one, we don't need it, so we'll just create a functional component with an JSX arrow function. This is what an arrow function looks like if you haven't been using it before. Every component in React also have to return something. So we do that, and we wrap the return in parentheses. This is because if you don't wrap it in parentheses, you have to write it in one row. And here you can write it in as many rows as you want and make the code look nice and more structural. So I highly recommend to always use parentheses in the return statement. You also need to wrap everything you return in one element. You can't return child elements, so wrap everything in a div for now. There's also something else that's called React fragments that we're going to use later on in this component. So we'll talk about that also later on. So for now, just use a div. And we want to render our header and our home component. Then the last thing you have to do with this component is export it with JSX syntax like this. So there you have it. This is a basic component we can use for now, and we will modify it later. So we continue and also create our base for the home component. So we create a new file in the home directory that's called home.js. And we do the same thing here. We import React, but for this one, we're also going to import the component by itself. I'll show you this in a second why. We also need to import our CSS. That's called home.css. Like this. This one is going to be a stateful class component. That's why I also imported the component by itself. I'll show you why now. So we create a JSX class that's called home, and it extends component. If we hadn't imported the component by itself, we had to write React before and a dot. So you can remove this now and it will work perfectly. It's just fine. And you can do it either way. It's just preferences. I like to do it the other way, so I will revert it back to that. Whoops. Oh, yeah, of course. Like this. And we can put the state here also. It will be empty for now, and we will make that later. The class component also need to have a render method. We create one like that, and in the render method we make our return statement just as before, and we have a parenthesis there. So what are we going to return here? Yeah, for now we're just going to return a div that says home, so just so we know that it's working. And of course we have to export it. We do it like before with the JSX syntax for exporting it like this. And this is good enough for now for this component. We'll come back to this a lot. It will include a lot of imports and code and methods later on. Now we need to create our header component. So first select the header directory and create a new file and call it header.js. So we do as before, we import React from React. This is going to be a stateless component, so we don't need to make the import of the component by itself. And I will say this looks boring. You write the same stuff over and over again now, but I highly recommend doing this at the start of your journey to learning React, because it will almost get automatically done if you do it many times. You can, of course, if you want, you can copy paste it, but I strongly recommend not doing it here. We also, for now, need to just import the CSS here in this component also. And as I said, it's going to be a stateless functional component. So we make an JSX arrow function for this one too. And we create the return statement with a parenthesis as before. We can also do the export now. Export default header. And for this one, we're going to write some divs in here. And they may look like regular HTML divs or tags. And they may look like regular HTML tags, but it's actually not. It's something that's called JSX. JSX is a syntax extension that's used a lot in React. You can create every element in React with the React create element method. That's a more complicated thing of doing this, especially if you want to nest different elements and things like that. But you can create, let's say we want to create a div that has a class name of React div with a content of this is a test. Oh, I forgot the curly braces. It should be like this. Yeah, you can do every element in React like this, but I don't recommend it, because if we do it with JSX instead, we can write it almost like a regular DOM element. So we create a div with a class name of RMDB header. And as you see here, the only difference now is that you have to write class name with a capital N instead of just writing class. So it's much like a regular div tag in HTML. And these classes are predefined by me. As I said before, it's in the header.css file. We'll create another div with a class name of RMDB header content. And in this div, we'll need to have two different images, one for the logo and one for the movie database logo. So we create an image tag with a class name that's RMDB logo, and it needs to have a source, and we grab the image from our images folder, and it's called React movie logo png. And we also need to have an alt for this one, otherwise it will complain. And we self-close it. Then we do another image tag for the other logo that's called RMDB TMDB logo. And we have a source for this one as well. We grab that from images, and it's called RMDB logo PNG. And we have an alt that's called TMDB logo. And we self-close that one also. This is pretty much everything we need to do for now by this one. Make sure you save the files, the home, and we also need to save the index file. And we should have something showing up. Oh, it's an error. I have in the home.js, where do we have it? Component, it should say. Yeah, and there you see we have it. Whoops, we have one more error. I think it's good to show that there will be some errors when you code, and you fix them on the fly as you go. That's regular coding stuff. So we have our logo. There's something wrong. It should say TMDB logo. And there you have it. So there we have the header, and we see that it prints out home, as we did in the home component, so we know that it's working. In the next video, we'll continue to make the home page and create some more components. See you then.